Hello and welcome to another day of the 30-day inclusion challenge. My name is Ryan Vincent. I'm from a company called Involve. You've probably heard from us a little bit this week. But just for a refresher, we are a global network and consultancy specializing in diversity and inclusion. Today's taster session is going to be on gay privilege, getting beyond gay rights. So a little bit more about who I am other than just my name. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm one of the engagement and advisory managers at Involve. Essentially what that entails is going into organizations, finding out about their diversity and inclusion challenges, and helping them to find solutions and develop more inclusive cultures within them. Now, of course, those are just a couple of elements of my identity. As we all know, there are many, many, many different intersecting elements of one's identity. And what I really like about this image that we see on the right-hand side of the screen is these different elements of identity kind of positioned within how they relate to one's privilege and power, and also to the degree to which they might be marginalized within different contexts as well. As we can see on the left, we see some more of those sort of labels, if you will, which identify me along different dimensions. And as we can see, a lot of these actually place me within the more sort of privileged circles of the wheel on the right. So even though sort of in the broadest sense of sexual orientation as a gay man, I belong to a diverse community, a lot of the other aspects of my identity, being a native English speaker, being able-bodied, being white, being a cisgender man, being middle class, having a graduate education, all of these things place me within very privileged circles within this wheel of power and privilege that we see on the right here. So as we go through today's session, I just want you to keep this wheel in mind as we're talking about the various intersectional identities that exist within the LGBT plus community. So I've said the word LGBT plus community a lot. You'll probably hear me saying queer community quite a lot in this presentation as well. But what exactly is this? And what I really like about the image on the right is that it's a really sort of accurate or visceral representation of what we're talking about when we're talking about the queer community and how it's represented and how people show up for it in today's society. As we can see, white cisgender men who fit a certain image sit on the top of this iceberg, while a whole lot of other diverse identities sit beneath it. Now, all of these individuals belong to the queer community or the LGBT plus community, but as we can see here, some of them are enjoying the benefits of progress a little bit more than some of the others who are underneath the water that we see here. Queer community and LGBT plus, these are really, really expansive labels that describe so many different identities, so many different communities. There's a whole lot of diversity within the community. And unfortunately, while that comes with so many benefits and makes the community so rich, it also means that there are a lot of prejudices and discrimination that come with that, both within the community itself, between members of the community, and also externally to that community as well, meaning that those individuals are experiencing it from the outside in. Now, all of these individuals on this image are operating within systems of privilege and power, as we saw from the wheel on the previous slide. Now, this final sentence on this slide I really like. It's a very good way of describing everything I've been talking about. There are as many ways to be LGBT plus as there are LGBT plus people. So what are the reasons behind this? Why does this picture look like this in the first place? Now, to go through this, we have to look through history. And history is full of language changes and symbol changes, not just for the LGBT plus community, but for diversity and inclusion more broadly, and for culture more broadly, of course. As we can see from especially the first instance of how LGBT plus rights have been talked about in kind of the modern era, we see that some of the language that used to be used is very much now outdated. Some of it is actually quite insulting or might be considered a form of bigotry, such as the word transvestite, which isn't used anymore to describe transgender individuals. But this language was very common even for individuals who are identifying within this group as well. As we can see, the language is sort of attempting or adapting to become more and more inclusive throughout time. to try and include as many different people as possible within the conversation. And now what we're seeing since the late 1990s and into kind of now, we're seeing a lot more acronyms cropping up to try and include even more people. Now we see these changes reflected in the symbols that are used to represent the LGBT+ community as well. From the very first iteration of the Pride flag to some of the more modern iterations, with the most commonly used one now being the Progress flag that we see on the far right-hand side on the top row, to try and include and really pull out to make sure that we are paying attention to some of the most marginalized groups within the LGBT+ community. This is represented by the black and brown stripes, representing ethnically diverse or queer people of color, and the transgender flag, which has been integrated on the far left side of that flag. Now, as is the case with language, so is the case for the symbols. These are likely to evolve as well. This year, we've seen this flag that you see on the bottom of the screen being introduced. I haven't seen it too widely used, but some people are using it. And this flag integrates the intersex flag into it as well. So as we try and be more and more inclusive with our language, we're also trying to be more and more inclusive with our symbols as well. And this is constantly evolving. So we've talked a little bit about the history. Where exactly are we now? Now, as I said, LGBT+ discrimination is real and present, and individuals within the community are still experiencing prejudice, discrimination, harassment. But what we're seeing, and as you can see from some of the stats on the right-hand side, is that these are a lot more prevalent for individuals who identify as people of color, who identify as trans, or identify within that plus that we see in LGBT+. So some of the most disadvantaged groups within the LGBT+ community are those who are the most marginalized or diverse, ethnically diverse individuals, trans individuals, and those falling within the plus in LGBT+. Now, unfortunately, language hasn't been super helpful in this regard. LGBT+ is this really, really broad label that is often attached to things that don't include the entire community. So it's really important to be very specific with our language and making sure that we're understanding the language that we're using. If we're going to be using LGBT+, making sure that we're representing all of that community within that as well. Now, just because the acronym is useful doesn't mean it isn't sometimes unhelpful for the very same reasons that I was just going through. I would really implore you in your own spare time to go through the statistics and the research that's cited on the right-hand side of this slide. It's some very interesting stuff and definitely describes in a lot of detail, if you're a stats geek like I am, some of these issues that we're talking about. So who is getting left behind in these conversations? LGBT+ women, LGBT+ people of color, trans and gender minorities, and identities falling in the plus in LGBT+. This could be anything from pansexual, asexual, agender, demisexual, two-spirit, any of those things and more. And also questioning identities as well. Those who haven't necessarily decided to come out yet, maybe don't want to come out yet, or just questioning their identity as well. We're starting to see some of the challenges of using labels and using symbols when we see all of these individuals who aren't being included necessarily in all of the conversations that we see and all of the media that we see representing the LGBT+ community. Now, what's really unfortunate and kind of ironic about this is that a lot of these individuals, LGBT+ women, trans people of color, were the individuals who were spearheading the initial kind of really radical movements of LGBT+ rights, of which a lot of people such as myself are really benefiting from. But as we saw from some of the statistics on the previous slide, a lot of communities really aren't yet. So how can we change? What can we actually do about this? Now, in a workplace context, this means auditing your LGBT+ network, auditing your organization to find out what kind of LGBT+ activism is going on, the demographics within those groups and the activities themselves, who is being represented, what kind of messages are being sent. All of those questions should be being asked. Now, if there isn't representation, making sure that you're working with other networks, and indeed, even if there is representation, making sure you're working in a cross-collaborative way with these networks, both internally and externally as well. The number of organizations who I've spoken to who have said things like, we don't have any trans people, we don't have any queer people of color. Even if they don't think they do, they might, but also just not having them is not an excuse not to be sending messages out to that community and making sure that they know they're supported by your organization as well. So that external work is really, really, really important. And this is a part of broadening that support, examining the charities and activist groups that you're involving yourself with, and also the creators from diverse backgrounds that you might be consuming media from, consuming products from. All of these things are questions you should be asking as an individual, but also as a business. What suppliers are you sourcing from? All of these questions are super, super important. And of course, being proactive in your workplace policies and the development of support for individuals, making sure that it's proactive, not waiting for someone to raise the question, where's our transitioning policy, for example. Just because nobody's done it at the organization yet doesn't mean somebody maybe might want to be doing that. So make sure that those kinds of things are in place before somebody asks. Can be a huge way to show support for individuals beyond the G and LGBT+. As an individual, make sure you're broadening your learning, questioning the language and symbols that you're using as well. As I said, this can be anything from what television shows you're watching, what movies you're watching. Documentaries can be a great source of learning for these kinds of things, and Netflix has tons of them, believe me. And a really, really important point, especially poignant for myself within the community, just because you are LGBT+ or belong to the community, this does not mean that you have LGBT+ activism covered. Make sure that you're engaging with activism from other elements of LGBT+ and beyond as well. Be an ally to identities outside of your own, and we can help kind of spearhead and make sure that this change is happening radically and quickly as well. And finally, use labels with purpose and awareness. Make sure, as I've been talking about, you understand how these symbols and nuances in language kind of interact with individual identities. And most importantly, just because you use certain language doesn't mean somebody else does as well. So make sure that you are respecting how somebody identifies. If they correct you or say, I don't like that label, make sure that you are using the label that they have chosen for themselves, as it's deeply personal and can affect one's sense of belonging, one's sense of inclusion, both with you personally and within the organization as well. So that's been a very, very swift whistle-stop tour of gay privilege and LGBT+ inclusion beyond just the G. If you'd like more information, please do feel free to get in touch with us at Involve. I could probably talk about this for days. So please do get in touch and make sure that you come around tomorrow for a session from Give Out that is sure to be fantastic. Thanks for sticking with us for the 30-day inclusion challenge. I've been Ryan Vincent, and have an excellent day.